It was a crisp autumn afternoon at Pinewood Park, where families gathered to enjoy the warm embrace of the golden sunlight. Chloe, a vibrant 12-year-old black girl with a radiant smile, was spinning the wheels of her old, slightly worn wheelchair across the park's winding paths. Her laughter echoed as she watched children play tag, their joyous shrieks blending with the rustling leaves. David, her father, a Navy SEAL with a commanding yet calm demeanor, watched her from a bench nearby. His heart swelled with pride as Chloe waved to a group of kids, her confidence undeterred by her circumstances. To him, she was a symbol of resilience, a light that refused to dim. Suddenly, a man's harsh voice cut through the idyllic scene. "Hey, watch where you're going," he barked, his words laced with irritation. Chloe, startled, looked up just in time to see a tall man in his late 40s storming toward her. His face was twisted in anger, as if her presence in the park had somehow personally offended him. "I am sorry," Chloe stammered, her voice trembling slightly. But her apology seemed to fuel his fury. Without warning, he shoved the side of her wheelchair, causing it to tip precariously. Chloe tumbled onto the grass with a soft cry, her chair clattering behind her. A hush fell over the park as onlookers froze, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and disbelief. David's heart stopped. In an instant, his military training and instincts kicked in. He was on his feet, closing the distance between them in long, purposeful strides. His eyes locked on the man, burning with a fury that sent chills through the crowd. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" David's voice was low and steady, each word a warning. He knelt beside Chloe first, his hands trembling as he helped her up. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his tone softening, though his jaw remained tight. Chloe nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm okay, Dad. Just scared." David straightened, towering over the man who now looked uneasy, glancing around as murmurs of disapproval grew louder among the gathering crowd. "I didn't mean to," the man began, his voice faltering. "Didn't mean to what?" David interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. "Push a child? A child in a wheelchair? What kind of person does that?" The man hesitated, his bravado shrinking under David's unyielding stare. I wasn't thinking," he muttered, his arrogance replaced by a nervous shuffle of his feet. David's glare didn't waver. "You're going to apologize to my daughter. Right now. And you're going to mean it." The man swallowed hard, his face flushed with embarrassment. He turned to Chloe, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry." Chloe looked up at him, her dark eyes shining with a mix of hurt and unexpected grace. "I accept your apology," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But next time, think before you act. It's not okay to hurt people, no matter how you feel." Her words, spoken with a maturity beyond her years, silenced the crowd. For a moment, even David found himself speechless, pride swelling in his chest. The man nodded stiffly and hurried away, his head bowed under the weight of collective judgment. The onlookers began to move closer, their faces filled with concern. A young man with a first aid kit knelt beside Chloe, offering to check her for any injuries. Another woman placed a comforting hand on David's arm. "Your daughter is amazing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She handled that better than most adults would." David managed a small smile, his hand resting protectively on Chloe's shoulder. "She's stronger than she looks," he replied, his voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. As the crowd began to disperse, David knelt beside Chloe again, brushing a stray leaf from her hair. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, honey," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But I promise, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Chloe smiled faintly, her spirit slowly rekindling. "It's okay, Dad. As long as I have you, I'll be okay." David's heart ached at her resilience, and he silently vowed to protect her from the cruelty of the world. As they left the park, the broken wheelchair in tow, David's mind was already racing with plans to replace it. For Chloe's sake, he would ensure she never felt powerless again. David's pulse still pounded from the incident. As he and Chloe sat on a bench at the edge of the park, her wheelchair resting awkwardly beside them, the memory of her fall replayed in his mind. The quiet strength in Chloe's response to the man's shove filled him with pride, but the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior refused to fade. The man who had hurried off moments before had not gone far. He lingered by the fountain, his demeanor shifting between nervousness and a false air of defiance. David's sharp, military-trained instincts told him this wasn't over. He stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the fading light, and approached the man with measured steps. "Hey," David called out firmly, his voice carrying an authority that stopped the man in his tracks. The man turned, his expression caught between annoyance and guilt. "I already apologized," he said gruffly, attempting to dismiss the confrontation. David stopped a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. His voice was calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "An apology means nothing if it isn't sincere. Do you even understand what you did back there?" The man shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering under David's unrelenting gaze. "Look, I was having a bad day, all right? I didn't mean anything by it." David took a step closer, his voice lowering but gaining weight. "A bad day doesn't give you the right to hurt a child. And it sure doesn't give you the right to push around someone who's already fighting battles you'll never understand." The man's eyes flicked toward Chloe, who was watching from the bench. She sat upright, her small frame radiating quiet courage despite the weariness in her posture. Her gaze was steady, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The man hesitated, his voice softening for the first time. "I didn't mean to scare her. I just lost my temper." David didn't let up. "You didn't just scare her. You knocked her down, damaged her wheelchair. What if she had been seriously hurt? You need to own up to what you've done, not just to her, but to yourself." The man seemed to shrink under David's words. He glanced around, as if hoping for an escape, but the onlookers who had gathered earlier were still there, their quiet presence a reminder that his actions had not gone unnoticed. Chloe, sensing the tension, wheeled herself forward. Her old chair creaked slightly, a stark reminder of the damage it had sustained. "Dad," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. David turned, his features softening immediately at the sight of his daughter. Chloe looked at the man, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and strength. "I don't need him to keep saying he's sorry," she said. "But I think he needs to understand why what he did was wrong." Her words landed heavily in the air, her maturity once again disarming everyone around her. The man looked at Chloe, his expression shifting from defensiveness to something resembling shame. "You're right," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He took a hesitant step toward Chloe. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time looking directly at her. "I shouldn't have done that. I wasn't thinking." Chloe nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said simply. "But next time, maybe think before you act. People deserve kindness, even when you're having a bad day." David watched the exchange, his chest tightening with emotion. He felt an overwhelming pride in his daughter, her ability to stand tall in the face of adversity, her willingness to extend grace to someone who had wronged her. The man nodded once, then walked away without another word. David let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing as the tension eased. As Chloe wheeled back to the bench, a small crowd of onlookers murmured words of encouragement and admiration. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes stepped forward and knelt beside Chloe. "You're an incredible young lady," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've taught all of us something today." Chloe smiled shyly, her cheeks tinged with color. "Thank you," she said softly. David placed a hand on Chloe's shoulder, his grip firm yet gentle. "You did great, sweetheart," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You're stronger than anyone I know." Chloe looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I learned from the best," she said with a small grin. As the sun began to set over the park, David and Chloe gathered their things, ready to head home. Though the day had been fraught with challenges, it had also revealed the strength of their bond and the power of standing up for what was right. The park had returned to a relative calm after the confrontation. The rustling leaves and distant laughter of children playing in the field masked the storm of emotions that lingered for Chloe and her father, David. Chloe sat quietly in her damaged wheelchair, her small hands gripping the armrests. Her bright smile had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve that only David could fully understand. A young man in his 20s approached hesitantly, holding a small first aid kit. His curly hair bounced slightly as he knelt beside Chloe, his eyes full of concern. "Hey there," he said gently. "Do you mind if I check your hands and knees?" That fall looked rough. Chloe hesitated, glancing at her father, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Go ahead," she said softly. The man worked quickly but carefully, cleaning a small scrape on her knee and applying a bandage. "You're really brave," he said, his voice steady but kind. "Not many people would have handled what you did back there the way you did." Chloe managed a faint smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Nearby, a woman in a floral dress, holding her toddler's hand, approached David. "I just wanted to say your daughter is remarkable," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "She's wise beyond her years." David nodded, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "She teaches me something new every day," he replied, his voice filled with pride. As more people began to gather, offering their words of encouragement, Chloe's spirits seemed to lift. A boy about her age stepped forward, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. "That chair's kinda beat up," he said shyly, glancing at the bent frame. "I've got a cousin who fixes bikes. Maybe he could take a look at it." David smiled warmly at the boy. "Thank you." "That's very kind of you," he said, though his mind was already racing with plans to get Chloe a new chair. The thought of her enduring even a single day without proper mobility was unbearable. As the crowd gradually dispersed, David crouched next to Chloe, placing a hand on her shoulder. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice low and soothing. Chloe looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I'm okay, Dad," she said after a moment. It's not fair. Why do people have to be so mean?" David sighed, the weight of her question heavy in the air. "I wish I had an answer for you," he admitted. "Some people act out of fear, others out of ignorance. But what matters is how we respond. And you responded with grace, Chloe. That's what makes you stronger than them." Chloe's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "Do you think the man will change?" she asked quietly. David paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I do know that you showed him something he probably hadn't seen before: kindness in the face of his cruelty. That kind of thing sticks with people, even if they don't admit it." Chloe nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line as she absorbed her father's words. "I hope he does," she said softly. David's heart ached for his daughter. He reached out and gently adjusted a strand of her hair. "You're an incredible person, Chloe. Don't ever forget that." A voice interrupted their quiet moment. "Excuse me," said an elderly man with a weathered face and a kind smile. "I couldn't help but notice what happened earlier. I run a local foundation that helps kids with disabilities. If you don't mind, I'd like to help you get a new wheelchair for Chloe." David blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the man's generosity. "That's incredibly kind of you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "But I can't accept charity." The man shook his head. "It's not charity. It's community. Your daughter inspired everyone here today, including me. This is the least we can do." Chloe looked up at the man, her eyes wide with surprise. "Really?" she asked. "Really," the man replied, his smile widening. "You've shown more courage today than most people show in a lifetime. Let us give something back." David hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the park in hues of orange and pink, Chloe leaned back in her chair, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. For the first time that day, she felt seen not just as a girl in a wheelchair, but as someone who mattered. David, standing protectively beside her, felt a renewed determination to ensure her future would be as bright as her spirit. Together, they left the park, carrying with them not just the weight of the day's events, but the undeniable proof that kindness and resilience could turn even the darkest moments into something powerful. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow in Chloe's room. She sat cross-legged on her bed, scrolling through her tablet, her damaged wheelchair leaning against the wall. The events at the park still lingered in her mind, but today felt different. There was a sense of hope in the air, and it came with the sound of her father's voice calling from downstairs. "Chloe, come on down. I have something to show you." David's voice carried a tone of excitement, something she hadn't heard in a while. Chloe carefully slid off her bed and made her way to the stairs. As she descended, she saw David standing in the living room next to something covered with a large sheet. He was grinning, his arms crossed as if trying to contain his anticipation. "What is it, Dad?" Chloe asked, her curiosity piqued. David stepped forward and gently pulled the sheet away, revealing a sleek state of the art wheelchair. Its frame was lightweight yet sturdy, the wheels glowed softly with LED lights, and the padded seat looked like it belonged in a luxury car. Chloe's mouth dropped open. "Is that for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David nodded, his smile widening. "It's yours. Custom made. It's not just a chair, Chloe, it's your freedom. And you deserve it." Chloe's eyes filled with tears as she moved closer, running her hands over the smooth frame. "Dad, this must have cost so much." "How did you?" David knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The man from the foundation? He covered most of it. But even if he hadn't, I would have figured it out. There's nothing I wouldn't do for you, Chloe." Overwhelmed, Chloe threw her arms around her father's neck, holding him tightly. "Thank you, Dad," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This means everything to me." David held her close, his heart swelling with love and pride. "You mean everything to me, kiddo." After a few moments, Chloe wiped her eyes and looked at the wheelchair again. "Can I try it out?" David grinned. "I thought you'd never ask." He helped her settle into the new chair, adjusting the straps and making sure everything was perfect. Chloe gripped the wheels, marveling at how effortlessly they moved. She spun in a circle, laughing as the LED lights lit up in a rainbow of colors. "This is amazing," she exclaimed, her face glowing with happiness. "It's so smooth and light. I feel like I'm flying." David watched her with a mixture of joy and relief. For the first time in days, the shadow that had clouded her spirit seemed to lift. "I knew you'd love it," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Chloe's excitement bubbled over. "Can we go to the park? I want to show everyone." David chuckled. "Of course. Let's make a day of it." Later that afternoon, they arrived at Pinewood Park, the same place that had been the site of so much pain just days before. But today, it felt different. Chloe wheeled herself confidently along the paths, her new chair drawing admiring glances and smiles from passersby. "Cool chair," a little boy called out as he ran past. "Thanks," Chloe replied, her grin widening. As they reached the open field, some of the kids from the other day waved at her. "Hey, Chloe," one of them shouted. "Your new wheels are awesome." Chloe's heart swelled with pride as she joined the group, her chair moving with ease over the grass. She no longer felt like an outsider. Instead, she felt like she belonged. David watched from a nearby bench, his arms resting on his knees. He was joined by the elderly man from the foundation, who had stopped by to see how Chloe was adjusting to her new chair. "She looks happy," the man said, his voice warm. David nodded, his eyes never leaving Chloe. "She is. This chair is more than just mobility for her, it's independence. Confidence. It's everything she needed." The man smiled knowingly. "It's amazing what a little support can do. Kids like Chloe are our future. She's going to change the world one day, you watch." David's chest tightened with emotion, and he nodded again, silently agreeing. "She already has," he said quietly. As the sun began to set, Chloe and David made their way back to the car. Chloe's cheeks were flushed from laughing and playing all afternoon, and her eyes sparkled with newfound confidence. "Today was the best day ever," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "Thank you for everything, Dad," David smiled, his heart full. "You're welcome, sweetheart. But this is just the beginning. There's so much more waiting for you." As they drove home, Chloe looked out the window, a small, contented smile on her face. For the first time in days, she felt whole again. And deep down, she knew her father was right. This was just the beginning. The days following Chloe's triumphant return to the park were filled with renewed joy. Her new wheelchair had given her not just mobility, but a sense of empowerment. She navigated the world with a confidence that inspired everyone around her, and her bond with her father, David, seemed stronger than ever. But David couldn't shake a gnawing feeling deep in his gut, silent alarm honed from years of military service. Something about the man who had shoved Chloe at the park didn't sit right with him. He knew people made mistakes, but the man's anger and arrogance had felt different. Dangerous even. David's instincts told him to stay vigilant, and those instincts had never been wrong before. It was a sunny Saturday morning when David and Chloe returned to Pinewood Park. The place was alive with activity, families picnicking under the shade of sprawling oaks, children racing bicycles along the trails, and teens practicing soccer in the open field. Chloe wheeled herself confidently across the playground, her face lit up with excitement as she joined a group of kids near the swings. David leaned against a nearby fence, his sharp eyes scanning the area. He wasn't just watching Chloe, he was watching everyone. Years of military training had taught him to notice the smallest details: body language, patterns, movements that seemed out of place. And then he saw him. The man from that fateful day. He was standing near the fountain, partially obscured by the trees, but there was no mistaking him. He wasn't yelling this time, nor was he drawing attention to himself. But the way he stood rigid, eyes scanning the park, set off every alarm in David's mind. The man wasn't here by accident. David straightened, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to alarm Chloe, who was laughing with her friends nearby, but he knew he couldn't ignore this. He took a deep breath, his focus sharpening. This wasn't a battlefield, but the stakes felt just as high. "Excuse me," David said, approaching a park security guard who was chatting with a family near the picnic tables. The guard, a burly man in his early 40s, turned to him with a polite nod. "Can I help you?" the guard asked. David gestured subtly toward the man near the fountain. "That guy over there," he said quietly. "He caused some trouble here a few days ago, shoved my daughter, damaged her wheelchair. I just saw him again, and something about his presence feels off." The guard's expression turned serious. "Did you report the incident? We handled it at the time, but I didn't file anything official," David admitted. "Now I'm starting to think I should have." The guard nodded, his gaze following David's gesture toward the man. "I'll keep an eye on him. If he does anything suspicious, we'll step in." "Thanks," David said, though the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. David returned to his spot by the fence, keeping a careful watch on both Chloe and the man. The man hadn't moved much, but every now and then, his gaze flicked toward Chloe. The sight made David's blood run cold. He pulled out his phone and texted his former Navy SEAL teammate, Ryan. "Need a favor. Are you free?" Ryan's reply came almost instantly. "Always." "What's up?" David quickly explained the situation, keeping his message short but detailed. Ryan didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way." Chloe wheeled over to David a few minutes later, her cheeks flushed from playing. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked, noticing the tension in his posture. David forced a small smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just keeping an eye on things." Chloe tilted her head, her dark eyes filled with curiosity. "You're being super serious. Is something wrong?" David knelt beside her, his hands resting gently on the armrests of her wheelchair. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said softly. "But I want you to stay close to the playground, okay? Don't wander off." Chloe nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Is it about that man?" David's chest tightened. He didn't want to burden her with his fears, but Chloe was perceptive beyond her years. "It might be," he admitted. "But I'm here, and I won't let anything happen to you." Chloe reached out and squeezed his hand. "I trust you, Dad." David smiled, his resolve strengthening. "Good. Now go have fun." Ryan arrived shortly after, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Dressed in a casual hoodie and jeans, he looked like any other parkgoer, but his presence immediately put David at ease. "Where is he?" Ryan asked quietly, his eyes scanning the area. David nodded toward the fountain. "By the trees. He hasn't done anything yet, but I don't like how he's watching Chloe." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Let's keep this low key. If he makes a move, we'll be ready." Together, the two men kept watch, their combined experience turning the park into a calculated perimeter. Chloe, blissfully unaware of the tension, continued to enjoy her afternoon, her laughter ringing out like a melody that reminded David why he fought so hard to protect her. As the afternoon wore on, the man eventually left, disappearing into the parking lot without incident. David exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing but not disappearing entirely. Ryan clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, calling me," Ryan said. "But I have a feeling this isn't the last we'll see of him." David nodded grimly. "I think you're right." As they packed up to leave, David made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he would ensure Chloe's safety. She was his world, and he would protect her with everything he had. The tension had simmered beneath the surface for days, but David knew it would boil over soon. His instincts as a Navy SEAL told him that the man's reappearance at the park wasn't a coincidence. He had studied the man's behavior, his lingering gazes toward Chloe, and the way he always seemed to position himself just out of direct confrontation. The signs were clear this wasn't over. David had prepared. He reached out to Ryan again, his trusted teammate, and shared his concerns. Ryan, ever the loyal friend, didn't hesitate to assist. Together, they devised a plan to ensure Chloe's safety while gathering evidence should the man make another move. On a crisp afternoon, David and Chloe returned to Pinewood Park. The sky was a vibrant blue, and the autumn air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves. Chloe, as always, was eager to explore in her new wheelchair, her smile radiating a quiet confidence that made David's heart ache with pride. "Dad, can I go to the swings?" Chloe asked, her voice full of excitement. David smiled, though his eyes flicked instinctively around the park. "Of course, sweetheart. Just stay where I can see you, okay?" Chloe nodded and wheeled off, her laughter mingling with the sound of children playing. David remained by the bench, his posture relaxed, but his senses alert. Ryan was nearby, blending into the crowd, his presence a silent reassurance. Then David saw him. The man emerged from behind a cluster of trees near the fountain, his movements deliberate yet cautious. He wasn't here by chance. David's jaw tightened as he observed the man inch closer to the playground. His focus was unmistakably on Chloe. David's phone buzzed. It was a text from Ryan. "I see him. Moving closer. Stay calm." David slipped his phone back into his pocket and stood, his heart pounding steadily in his chest. His military training had conditioned him for moments like this, moments when everything hinged on staying composed and controlled. The man paused near the swings, his gaze fixed on Chloe. She was laughing, unaware of the growing danger. David's fists clenched, but he forced himself to wait. Ryan was in position, a discreet camera in hand, documenting every move the man made. When the man finally stepped forward, David moved. "Excuse me," David called out, his voice firm yet calm. The man froze, turning slowly to face him. For a moment, there was a flicker of defiance in his eyes, but it quickly faded under David's unyielding stare. "Is there something I can help you with?" David asked, his tone sharp but measured. The man opened his mouth to speak but faltered, glancing around as if looking for an escape. "I've seen you here before," David continued, taking a step closer. "And I'm starting to wonder why you're always near my daughter." "I was just walking through," the man stammered, his voice unconvincing. Ryan appeared then, his presence calm but commanding. "We've got plenty of witnesses who can confirm otherwise," Ryan said, his voice low but resolute. "And we've been recording." The man's eyes darted between David and Ryan, panic creeping into his expression. "I didn't do anything," he protested, his voice rising. "Not yet," David replied coldly. "But your intentions are clear, and we're not letting you get any closer to her." A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs growing louder as they recognized the man from the earlier incident. The park's security guard approached, his hand resting on the radio at his hip. "What's going on here?" the guard asked, his tone serious. David gestured toward the man. "This guy's been lurking around the park, watching my daughter. We have footage of him acting suspiciously. I think it's time the police got involved." The man's face turned pale. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice shaking. "It won't be if you leave now and never come back," Ryan said, his tone sharp. "But if you so much as look her way again, we'll make sure the authorities know everything." The guard nodded, stepping closer to the man. "You should go. Now." The man hesitated for a moment before turning on his heel and walking briskly toward the parking lot. The crowd parted silently, their disapproving stares following him until he disappeared. As the tension eased, David knelt beside Chloe, who had watched the scene unfold from a distance. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. Chloe nodded, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and trust. "What happened, Dad?" David smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. Just know that I'll always be here to keep you safe." Chloe leaned forward, wrapping her arms around him. "I know you will," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Ryan approached, his expression calm but serious. "You did good," he said to David. "I think he got the message loud and clear." David nodded, his grip on Chloe tightening slightly. "Thanks, Ryan. I couldn't have done this without you." "Any time," Ryan replied. "That's what brothers are for." As they left the park that day, the air felt lighter, the shadows of fear dissipating under the strength of their bond. Chloe wheeled herself alongside David, her smile as bright as the afternoon sun. And though David knew the world wasn't free of danger, he also knew they could face anything together. The next day dawned bright and clear, as if the universe itself had decided to reset after the tension of the previous week. Chloe sat by the living room window, her fingers gently tracing the edge of her new wheelchair. It wasn't just a chair to her anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of protection, and of the love her father had shown her through every step of this ordeal. David walked in with 2 mugs of hot cocoa, the aroma of melted marshmallows filling the air. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, setting a mug on the table beside her. His tone was light, but his eyes carried the weight of everything they had been through. "Morning, Dad," Chloe replied, looking up at him with a small smile. She hesitated before adding, "Do you think he'll ever come back?" David sat down across from her, his hands wrapped around his mug. "I don't think so," he said firmly. "But even if he does, you don't have to worry about him. Ryan and I made sure he knows we're watching." Chloe nodded, her gaze drifting back to the window. "I wasn't scared of him," she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with thoughtfulness. "I was scared of what he might do. To me, to us." David's heart ached at her words. He reached across the table, his large hand covering hers. "You don't have to carry that fear, Chloe. That's my job to keep you safe." Chloe squeezed his hand, her dark eyes shimmering with unspoken emotion. "I know, Dad. And I trust you, but what if it happens to someone else? Someone who doesn't have a dad like you?" David leaned back, his chest tightening. She wasn't just thinking about herself, she was thinking about the world around her, about people who might be vulnerable, like she had been. It was one of the many things he admired about his daughter, her compassion, her ability to see beyond her own experience. "That's why we stand up," he said after a moment, his voice firm but warm. "That's why we don't let people like him think they can get away with it. And that's why you, Chloe, are going to change the world one day." Chloe's face softened, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You really think so?" David nodded. "I know so." You've already inspired everyone who knows you. That's just the beginning. Later that afternoon, they returned to Pinewood Park not to confront fear, but to reclaim the joy it had once brought them. The autumn air was crisp, and the park buzzed with life. Chloe wheeled herself confidently along the paths, waving to familiar faces who greeted her warmly. A young girl, no older than 6, ran up to Chloe with wide eyes. "Your chair is so cool," she exclaimed, pointing at the glowing wheels. Chloe grinned, spinning her chair in a quick circle. "Thanks. It helps me go super fast." The little girl giggled and clapped her hands, her delight contagious. Her parents approached, smiling apologetically. "Sorry about her," the mother said, though her tone was kind. "She's just fascinated by how brave and confident you are." Chloe's cheeks flushed, but she smiled. "It's okay." "Thank you." David watched from a bench nearby, his heart swelling with pride. Ryan joined him, carrying 2 bottles of water. "She's a natural," Ryan said, nodding toward Chloe. David took a sip of water and nodded. "She's got a light about her, doesn't she?" Even after everything she's been through, Ryan leaned back, crossing his arms. "That's the thing about resilience. It doesn't just survive the storm, it shines through it." David smiled at his friend, the truth of his words settling in his chest. Chloe's strength wasn't just in her ability to endure, it was in her ability to thrive, to inspire, and to remind everyone around her of the goodness still present in the world. As the day turned to evening, David and Chloe found themselves sitting by the fountain, watching the water shimmer under the setting sun. Chloe leaned her head against her father's arm, her voice soft but sure. "I like it here," she said. "Even after everything." David kissed the top of her head, his voice full of emotion. "Me too, sweetheart. This is our place now. A place where we've learned how strong we are." Chloe sat up, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think people can really change? Like that man. Do you think he'll ever be better?" David considered her question carefully, his brow furrowed. "I think everyone has the capacity to change," he said slowly. "But it's up to them to make that choice. What you did, Chloe showing him grace instead of anger, that's the kind of thing that can plant a seed. Whether it grows is up to him." Chloe nodded, her face softening. "I hope it does," she said simply. David wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close as the fountain's gentle rhythm filled the silence. "I hope so too," he said, his voice steady. "But even if it doesn't, you've already made the world a better place." As they left the park that night, the air felt lighter, almost sacred. Chloe wheeled herself alongside her father, her laughter echoing softly in the stillness. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't afraid anymore. And neither was David. The days that followed were quieter, but no less meaningful. Chloe and David had settled into a new rhythm, one that carried a profound sense of gratitude and strength. The shadows of the past week had faded, replaced by a deeper understanding of who they were as a family and the kind of impact they could have on the world. It was a sunny Sunday afternoon when Chloe and David decided to visit Pinewood Park again. This time, it wasn't just to reclaim the space, but to celebrate it. Chloe had invited a small group of friends from school, and David had packed a picnic, complete with Chloe's favorite chocolate chip cookies. The park, once the scene of conflict and fear, had become a symbol of healing and community. As they sat up near the playground, Chloe's laughter echoed through the air. She and her friends played a game of tag, her wheelchair zipping effortlessly across the grass as the LED lights on her wheels flashed brightly. Her joy was infectious, drawing smiles from nearby families who stopped to watch. David sat on a bench, his heart full as he watched his daughter thrive. A woman with a kind smile approached him, her young son trailing behind her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice warm. "Are you Chloe's dad?" David nodded, curious. "I am. Can I help you?" The woman smiled, glancing toward Chloe. "I just wanted to say how inspiring she is. My son, Ethan, uses a wheelchair too. He's always been a little shy about it, but seeing Chloe out there, so confident and full of life, it's made a difference for him. He told me he wants to be just like her." David's throat tightened with emotion. He looked at Ethan, who was watching Chloe with wide eyes and a hint of admiration. "That means a lot," David said, his voice thick. "Chloe's been through a lot, but she's stronger for it. And if her story can help someone else, well, that's everything." The woman nodded, her own eyes glistening. "Thank you for raising such a remarkable daughter." As she walked away, David leaned back on the bench, letting the weight of her words settle over him. Chloe wasn't just his inspiration. She was becoming a beacon for others too. Later in the afternoon, the group gathered around the picnic blanket. Ryan joined them, his easy smile and playful banter adding to the relaxed atmosphere. He handed Chloe a soda and sat cross-legged on the grass. "You've got fans, you know," Ryan teased, nodding toward Ethan, who was now playing nearby. "That little guy thinks you're a superhero." Chloe blushed, her cheeks dimpling as she smiled. "I'm not a superhero," she said, her voice modest. "I'm just me." Ryan grinned. "That's what makes it even better. Real heroes don't wear capes, they just show up, every day, and make the world a little better by being themselves." David watched the exchange, his chest tightening with pride. He knew Ryan was right. Chloe's strength wasn't flashy or loud, it was quiet, steady, and unshakable. And it was changing lives. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the park in shades of gold and crimson, Chloe wheeled over to her father. "Thanks for today, Dad," she said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "It's been perfect," David smiled, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You're welcome, sweetheart. But really, it's all you. You're the one who turned this place into something special." Chloe tilted her head, her dark eyes thoughtful. "Do you think the man from the park, the one who hurt me, do you think he'll remember what happened?" David's expression grew serious, but his voice remained gentle. "I think he will. And I think what you said to him about kindness and thinking before you act will stay with him. You planted a seed, Chloe. Whether it grows is up to him." Chloe nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "I hope it does," she said quietly. "I hope he learns to be better." David reached out and gently turned her chair, so she was facing him. "Even if he doesn't," he said, his voice steady, "you've already made the world a better place. That's what matters." Tears welled in Chloe's eyes, but she blinked them away, her lips curving into a small, determined smile. "Then I'll keep trying," she said. "I'll keep being kind. For me and for anyone who needs it." David hugged her, his arms strong and steady around her small frame. "You already are, Chloe. You already are." As they packed up and left the park that evening, Chloe's laughter lingered in the air, a melody of hope and resilience. The world wasn't perfect, it never would be, but Chloe had shown that even in the face of cruelty, there was room for grace, strength, and change. And as David walked beside his daughter, he knew that together they could face anything.